I want you to imagine a ragtag group of members of various races that look and act mostly just like humans, but with varying heights and proportions. They stand against a green tide of orcish menaces with hunched posture and slanted brows. Orcs who are aided by the uneducated, backwards, savage tribes of corruptible, greedy men. These orcs are led by an evil emperor hell-bent on fulfilling his true master's wishes of world domination and the destruction of the morally righteous, intellectual monarchist society that our heroes nearly give their lives to defend. You ever notice that Lord of the Rings is kinda fucking racist? Hi, my name is Sally, and let me be clear, I'm not calling Tolkien a racist. Okay, I mean, well, he's not, but, it's just... Okay, let's run it back. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, or simply Tolkien, was a fantasy author born in the early 1890s and died in the early 1970s, living to a ripe old age of 81. Before his death, between the years of 1954 and 1955, he released a trilogy of medieval fantasy books that would go on to not only revitalize what many believe to be a dead genre of literature, but redefine it on a fundamental level. That trilogy was known as the Lord of the Rings. These three bludgeoning weapons of novels would go on to be considered the Holy Trinity, the progenitor of all later medieval fantasy works to come. And that's not always a good thing. Now, these three books are of legend, and for good reason. I'm not here to say you're bad for liking Tolkien, or that Tolkien's inspiration on the fantasy genre should be entirely discarded because of the problematic elements of his work. However, as a wise woman once said, it's possible, and even necessary,
to simultaneously enjoy media while also being critical of its more problematic or pernicious aspects.
But I'm going to make one serious hot take in this video. Tolkien is holding the medieval fantasy genre back. Enough clarification, let's go full aggro. Monarchism sucks. The idea that we should be ruled unquestioningly by a hereditary monarch is almost self-evidently a poor one. But Tolkien didn't agree. He was British, and he was a product of his time. He grew up in an era of British colonialism, where the sun never set on the British Empire because they had colonies on both sides of the equator. As such, there are some heavy pro-monarchist themes within the story. The primary plot of The Lord of the Rings is about an alliance between the various nations of the free peoples of Middle-earth, and the savage race of orcs, their evil and tribal human allies who are the only black people in the entire story, and the treacherous wizard Saruman, who are all being led by the Dark Lord Sauron. The story ends when, after the defeat of Sauron, the world is put back in order, because now Aragorn, the true and good king, is on the throne of Gondor. It's important to point out that Aragorn isn't considered the more true and good king because he's necessarily more honest, less cruel, or even cares more about his people. His actual policies once he becomes king is unknown. All we're ever told is that he's the one who will fix everything once he's on the throne, solely by nature of his blood relation to Isildur. And this is one of those big takeaways that the medieval fantasy genre often feels the need to pay homage to. The concept of the Good King. Uriel Septim VII in the Elder Scrolls series. King British in Ultima. King Aidan from Deltora Quest. Across the medieval fantasy genre, writers often seem to be scared to write genuine criticisms of the system of monarchy, and instead pin any problems not with a systemic failure of that hierarchy, but with corrupt individuals. essentially saying that monarchy could work, or even be a good thing, so long as the right monarch is on the throne. Now, you could make the argument that the single most influential piece of medieval fantasy literature, which came to shape the genre as it exists today, from which basically all medieval fantasy writers borrow and take inspiration from, had nothing to do with this trend of medieval fantasy stories that have a pro-monarchy bent to them. And you'd be wrong, but yeah, you could probably make that argument. This is one of the ways that Tolkien greatly influences the medieval fantasy genre on a thematic level today. But Tolkien's influences run deeper than simply influencing thematic trends within the genre. Now, this is where I'm going to have to put a content warning for the rest of the video. If discussions of racism, fictional or otherwise, make you deeply uncomfortable, I understand, and I urge you to close the video now. For those remaining, we get to discuss the least lovely Mongol types. Oh god, do I really have to say that? Is that in the script? Now, look. Saying that The Lord of the Rings is racist is a hot take on the same level as saying Belle from Beauty and the Beast has Stockholm Syndrome, or that Mario is a sociopath. It's incredibly well-trodden territory. And just like those two examples, just leaving it at Lord of the Rings is racist is a massive oversimplification of a long-standing analytical debate within the sphere of the medieval fantasy genre. The 7-page paper, Why is the Only Good Orc a Dead Orc by Anderson Rearick out of Mount Vernon Nazarene University, goes into detail about how this debate has been going on since the 70s. And I can believe it. When asked, Tolkien would regularly go into detail about all the racial and ethnic minorities he based the various races on, most notoriously describing orcs as
squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes, in fact degraded and repulsive versions of the, to Europeans, least lovely Mongol types.
But I want to go more in-depth with a specific example of his racism, and one that hits much closer to home for me, the Dwarves. So, in Tolkien's universe, all life was created by a series of godlike entities, with capital G God, also known as Eru Ilúvatar, or just Eru, having created all the lesser creators known as the Ainur, who helped Eru sorta fill out the universe, as well as the humans and elves, two races of near-perfect creation. Who created the Dwarves? One of the Ainur, specifically Vala Aule, because he was too impatient to wait for Eru Ilúvatar to get done creating the humans and elves. Now, in this setting, dwarves are known for a few things, but above all, they're known as being, by their very nature, greedy, insular, vain, petty, and self-interested. This is why, if you're unaware, they were immediately ruled out of being the ones to, quote-unquote, inherit Middle-earth after all the elves go and sail into the west.
The time of the elves is over. My people are leaving these shores. Who will you look to when we've gone? The dwarves? They hide in their mountains seeking riches. They care nothing for the troubles of others.
It is in men that we misplace our hope.
Men. Men are weak.
The unspoken part about this whole thing, that which is implicitly stated, is that they're like this because they weren't created by Eru Ilúvatar. They're of literal lesser creation than the humans and elves, and are therefore inherently inferior to the two. So you have this race of long-bearded, big-nosed, greedy, insular people who are obsessed with gold and material things and are stated to be inferior to humans. Oh, wait, shit, these guys are supposed to be Jews. Now, whenever criticism of this sort of nature is applied to a fictional setting, fans of that setting, as I'm well aware, will often respond by simply feigning ignorance, or acting like that wasn't the author's intent, as if to say that by making such criticism, you're inherently reaching and pulling at straws. It'd be real bad, for them, if I happened to have direct evidence from a primary source stating that this comparison was intentional. Ahem!
The dwarves, of course, are quite obviously, wouldn't you say that in many ways they remind you of the Jews? The language of the dwarves is Semitic in cast, leaning phonetically to Hebrew as suits the dwarvish character.
That's a quote! That's a quote from Tolkien! In a BBC radio interview. Yeah. This isn't some extrapolation I'm making from inferences based on the content of the text. This is straight from the mouth of the author. The dwarves are directly based on the Hebrew people, my people, and they're stated from within the text to be inferior to that of the humans. In fairness to Tolkien, I don't believe he's anti-Semitic. When asked via letter by a Nazi if he had any Jewish blood in him, he stated the following.
Thank you for your letter. I regret that I am not clear as to what you intend by Arish. I am not of Aryan extraction, that is Indo-Iranian. As far as I am aware, none of my ancestors spoke Flindistani, Persian, Gypsy, or any related dialects. But if I am to understand that you are inquiring whether I am of Jewish origin, I can only reply that I regret that I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people.
And when speaking about a local news article, which openly advocated genociding the German people as retribution for the Holocaust, Tolkien says this.
The Germans have just as much right to declare the Poles and Jews exterminable vermin, subhuman, as we have to select the Germans. In other words, no right, whatever they have done.
Clearly, these are not words from a man who harbors deep anti-Semitic sentiments, but that does not necessarily excuse his work from having intentionally used anti-Semitic stereotypes. Even looking at other elements of the world, like I previously mentioned, the only humans who side with Sauron are the Easterlings, who are the only explicitly dark-skinned population of humans in Middle-earth, who are most commonly known for siding with whatever big evil bad guy is trying to conquer the world. They sided with Morgoth during the First Age and Sauron during the Third. It's a lot to unpack, but I hope this is enough for you to get the general idea that, yeah, Tolkien's work has some pretty problematic aspects to it, but this wouldn't really matter at all if I couldn't also demonstrate that those problematic aspects also carried into other works of fiction inspired by Tolkien. Good thing I can, though. Immediately going in with something I'm far more familiar with than Lord of the Rings. Warhammer Fantasy! Yes! Back in the comfort zone, baby! I knew we could make it! Warhammer Fantasy was invariably inspired by Lord of the Rings. In fact, it's essentially a different take on the exact same world. But there's a spin on it. Everybody's kind of an asshole! Warhammer has never been a franchise that's had a good faction, the same way Lord of the Rings has. Sadly, in an attempt to make all of the factions roughly equally as bad, it's caused a whole lot of problems. Dwarfs in Warhammer Fantasy share much in common with the Dwarves of Middle-earth. They both live in mountain fortresses, they both have so few women that most people genuinely think that female dwarves don't exist, and they're both incredibly anti-Semitic. A lot of it is common ground, so let me just rapid fire the stereotypes real quick. An obsession with gold and generally being rather vain or greedy, huge noses, large beards, insular or isolationist society, and selfish, with Warhammer Fantasy making all of these way more exaggerated and basically removing any element of goodness to dwarven society. Now, Tolkien didn't necessarily see the comparison between dwarves and Jewish people to be inherently an insult. Despite a lot of their more flawed aspects, the dwarves are generally portrayed as a noble people. Tolkien seemed to have thought very highly, in fact, of the resilience of the Hebrew people, and that reflects in how he represents his dwarves. The dwarfs of Warhammer Fantasy are given no such treatment, and all of their anti-Semitic components are dialed all the way up to 11. Dwarfs within Warhammer Fantasy are incredibly grudgeful and spiteful, with their king carrying around a gigantic book filled with grudges, and Khazalid society is organized entirely around fulfilling those grudges. And this aspect so perfectly brings out the anti-Semitic tropes used within their writing, as they literally go on massive wars purely because someone stole their gold. Their greed and their vanity and their spitefulness are their only motivating factors, with the exception of the Slayers, dwarfs who have committed some great sin and have devoted themselves completely to dying in battle as a form of penance. The dwarfs, or Dowie, of Warhammer Fantasy are, in my eyes, one of the clearest and most easily recognizable examples of how Tolkien's influence on the medieval fantasy genre creates a lot of problematic writing. I think it should be obvious, when you take a fictional race based upon stereotypes of actual ethnic cultures, but then portray them as blanketly evil and don't change anything else about them, you've just gone and done a racism. And it's not as if GW was simply ignorant towards the Semitic inspiration behind Tolkien's dwarves, given that they made those armies of Dowie who fell to the ruinous powers have a striking resemblance to a certain other Semitic culture that you might be familiar with. However, in complete fairness to Tolkien, the problematic aspects of Warhammer Fantasy do not all stem from Tolkienian inspiration. No, Warhammer Fantasy was, if not the originator, one of the first majorly successful medieval fantasy properties to do that thing, you know? That one thing that certain medieval fantasy authors like to do, where they base all of their humanoid factions off various European cultures, but reserve any inspiration from a non-European culture for the bestial races. The Lizardmen are the only race in Warhammer Fantasy that has roots in South American culture, specifically the Mayans, and they're a cold-blooded army of sociopathic lizard people. The Ogres are based on the Mongolians. Holy fuck! What is it with medieval fantasy authors and hating Mongolians? Least lovely Mongol types aside, clearly Warhammer Fantasy has problematic elements of it completely removed from Tolkien. But nevertheless, it is clear, at least to me, that Tolkien at least had a part to play in a lot of the toxic elements that went into Warhammer Fantasy. And Warhammer Fantasy would go on to inspire one of the most financially successful game franchises of all time. Warcraft started life as the brainchild of one Chris Metzen, who would go on to voice several characters in the RTS itself. However, as with all creative projects, it's impossible to list one major point of inspiration. But one thing you cannot deny is that Warcraft was heavily inspired by GW's Warhammer, to the point where Alan Adham wanted to gain the license to make their game a licensed Warhammer RTS. But due to several factors, including, most importantly, nobody else on the team wanting to do that in order to maintain creative control over their game's story and lore, this never worked out. Nonetheless, the old world had an impact on Warcraft to the point where neither series is able to be experienced completely detached from the other. There are myriad ways that you can draw comparisons between the two games, and in the interest of keeping this video, roughly finite in length, I'm going to keep this brief and simply cover the parts where Tolkien's inspiration is clear and visible. Which means we won't be talking about dwarves for once. No, other than living in a series of mountain fortresses, which by the release of Warcraft 1 in 1984 was simply considered a given aspect of dwarves in any medieval fantasy setting, they have very little in common with the dwarves of Tolkien's Middle-earth. Instead, we'll be talking about the orcs, and how it's a genuine improvement over Tolkien, and also how they've fallen into many of the same pitfalls as other fantasy writers. The biggest improvement the orcs in WoW have over the orcs in Tolkien is that Warcraft orcs are, and you won't believe me when I say this, actually people. I know, fucking crazy, right? Unlike most depictions of orcs where they are essentially mindless killing machines, orcs in Warcraft are people with complex motivations and cultures, and instead of being this marauding band of mindless warmongers, their goals in invading Azeroth are multifaceted and born out of desperation from their own world of Draenor slowly dying. Their culture radically transformed from that of a peaceful shamanistic society to a warrior culture of interstellar raiders as a natural reaction to the material conditions they found themselves in. It's genuinely compelling and interesting to play as Thrall in Warcraft 3 as you fight to free your people from the chains of oppression, not only from the Alliance of Lordaeron, but also from the Burning Legion, which forced your people to invade Azeroth in the first place. It's truly amazing stuff, but of course, Blizzard, being Blizzard, had to go and fucking ruin it. So, World of Warcraft comes out in 2004 and gets 2 expansions. One in 2007 and one in 2008. But after that, the next expansion of World of Warcraft wouldn't come out for another 2 years until, in 2010, Cataclysm releases. Now, Cataclysm is basically WoW 2. It changed so much about the game that if you asked most fans, they'd probably say they view pre- and post-Cataclysm World of Warcraft as entirely separate games. Blizzard even has legacy servers for a vanilla version of the game called World of Warcraft Classic. Part of what it changed, and the part we're concerned about, is that the faction leader of the Horde was changed from Thrall to Garrosh Hellscream. Now, Garrosh is... well, he's a fascist. He relies on populism and stirring up bigotry. He engages in doublespeak, both claiming that the Alliance is a weak and pitiful enemy, and also that they are strong beyond measure, and that drastic, preemptive attacks are necessary to defeat them. The main conflict of Mists of Pandaria is literally just him nearly dooming the entire planet in order to gain more power, and ends with a revolution forming within the Horde to besiege Orgrimmar and dethrone Garrosh. After Garrosh is defeated, he's imprisoned, immediately escapes before his trial, and wait a minute. Goes back in fucking time to warn his father not to drink the blood of Manaroth? What? So now, the confusion becomes apparent, because even after they avoid that whole drinking the blood of Manaroth thing, which is originally what turned them quote-unquote evil in the first place, they still decide to invade Azeroth.
We will never be slaves! But we will be conquerors.
Or try to, anyway. They're actually remarkably unsuccessful. In fact, their whole plan to invade Azeroth bit gets foiled within the first, 30 minutes of the expansion's leveling campaign, and then we just spend the rest of the expansion fucking colonizing alternate universe Draenor, and we're the heroes here? Not only did we immediately stop the Iron Horde from invading Azeroth, we then followed them back into their homeland to slaughter them by the fucking millions. I did a colonialism! God damn it! So, pretty clearly, the insinuation made here is obvious. The orcs, even without the influence of the Burning Legion, would have invaded Azeroth anyway. So clearly the Alliance is justified in dehumanizing and then slaughtering or enslaving all of them. Because That's what the Alliance wants to do, you realize? After the Second War, the Dark Portal, which let orcs travel freely between Draenor and Azeroth, got destroyed, and the orc race was nearly entirely wiped out by the Alliance. Those that did survive were sold into chattel slavery. Blizzard seems to be undecided about whether or not the orcs are just inherently bad, evil people or not, and just sort of flip-flop as they please. And that's really fucked up, because it ends up indirectly justifying all of the Alliance's oppressive policies that made orcs not even second-class citizens, but literally objects. Blizzard, please, you can't just have one faction have literal genocidal intent, while the other faction is a group of indigenous populations all based on historically oppressed native people, but then constantly play with the idea that the genocidal maniacs may actually be justified in their hatred of said minorities. Wow, Warcraft really does take a lot of inspiration from Warhammer, huh? Do I think this is intentional? No, probably not. I don't think Blizzard is legit trying to make us consider the positives of genocide. I think they just see a faction made up of clearly very non-human races and see them as an easy target to make the antagonists in any given story. And looping back to the primary topic of this video, I don't think this idea of orcs having no moral compass and just being evil, murderous bastards being a given would exist, were it not for the influence Tolkien has on the fantasy genre. Again, it's just like the pro-monarchy shit. You cannot just easily disregard it as a coincidence that the pro-monarchist themes of Lord of the Rings is continually reflected in other works in the genre, just as you can't do the same with Tolkien's racism and how it impacts the medieval fantasy genre today. I hope I've been able to illustrate how this web of inspiration has started to form. Tolkien inspired later works of medieval fantasy, which then went on to inspire even more. The medieval fantasy genre would not be the same without Tolkien, and that's a wonderful thing. But no piece of art is perfect, and no story is without problematic elements. I'm not advocating for completely disregarding and discarding the good things that Tolkien has done. I am, however, advocating that we think more critically about the potential baggage we take on when we write fiction. No art exists in a vacuum. No writer is able to craft entire worlds from whole cloth, but if we're going to take inspiration from other works, we need to be willing to critically analyze those points of inspiration, or else we'll be held back by them. Hi, thanks for watching the video. It took a while to make. I've been working on that video since like November, basically. So, yeah, it took a very long time to eventually make, but it's out now, and I hope you enjoyed it. I did not enjoy making it. Seriously, by the end, it was very difficult for me to, like, keep working on it. I really had to force myself through the last little bit, because, oh my god, I've just been working on it for so long that it just got too much eventually. I just ran out of energy to make it. But, you know, it's out now, and I am really happy with how it turned out. I think the final product is really good. If you thought the same, that's great. I would love if you could act on that by liking and subscribing to this channel. If we hit 1,000 subscribers by the end of this year, there will be a very special video I have planned to work on for if that happens. When that happens, you know? Yeah. Names of my patrons should be scrolling somewhere on the screen, and if you want your name to be among that list of patrons, you can go down to the description and give me money. but sadly, because of COVID and because of stuff like that, I've needed to raise the minimum amount you can pledge to be $2 instead of $1. So that's if you can't do that, it's totally understandable. It's totally fine. I would not want you to support me monetarily if it would put you at risk. No. Think about yourself first. And on top of that, I've also made a coffee page. So if you don't really like the commitment of Patreon, if you don't like, doing a full monthly subscription type service, then you can go to Coffee and just give me like however much money. The minimum donation amount is, $5. Other than that, share the video around, please, actually. YouTube really doesn't like my videos for some reason, and I keep getting people telling me that, hey, I'm not, like, my videos aren't showing up in my notifications or my feed, even if I ring the bell. So share the video around, make sure as many people as possible see it, because I think this is really important. I think this is something that more people need to discuss and talk about. So have a good day, and I'll see you next time.